Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. Well, now we're going to deal with a fifth, I reckon, just about, of the world's population in Brazil and India. So welcome onto the stage, please, Arminio Fraga, who is the founding partner of Gavea Investimentos. Arminio, please. And Shikha Sharma, who is the managing director of Axis Bank. Please welcome her onto the stage as well. So, although they came on the stage in that order, I'm going to do ladies first, and in the only proper measure of civilized behavior in order of the nation's cricketing ability. So let's start off with India. Now, India and Brazil are both part of the BRICS. And everybody, Jim O'Neill's been telling us all to invest in the BRICS for a decade because of their superior economic potential. But just in the fine magazine, The Economist, I looked up the numbers at the moment. Indian inflation is about 10%. The last quarter's growth was 0.1%. The current account balance is in deficit to the extent of 4% of GDP, and there's a 6% government deficit as a percent of GDP. So you're supposed to be, in India, setting the lesson to the rest of us in the decadent West. What's been going wrong with the Indian economic model?
So I think we have to take a medium-term perspective rather than worrying about every month's numbers. And I guess that's what the BRICS story was all about, looking at what the long-term potential would be. India has had some structural changes that we're trying to make over the last couple of years. Fiscal deficit and current account deficit has always been relatively high for India, given the stage of development. But it's creeped up a little bit post-2008 when we tried to do two things. One is make sure that the poor are covered. So there has been a lot more support of the lower income groups and transfers to the rural poor. There's also been a support in terms of money transfers to the farmers by having a minimum procurement price. That has had an impact in terms of fiscal deficit. But I think what it does, it allows for more sustainable growth over the long time, because India's growth has been accompanied with relatively less inequality than you see in some of the other countries. And I think that's the advantage of a democracy and having an inclusive kind of growth. So I wouldn't worry, as I said, about some of the short-term issues. But some of this also feeds into inflation. So the inflation numbers that you're seeing are a direct result of some of this support to minimum procurement prices to farmers, as also reducing subsidies on petrol, which means fuel prices go up and then feed into inflation. So inflation is going to resolve itself, I think, with a little bit of a lag. And as far as growth is concerned, despite the monthly number, India is still tracking for a GDP growth of 5.5% this year. And given the state of the world economy, I think that's not too bad.
And do you think that there is still an impetus for reform within the country? I mean, there was an idea that Mr. Singh, when he first was in office, was a reformer, and then the government seems to have run out of steam a bit. Do you think they're still keen to push that agenda forward?
I think one has to realize the compulsions of a coalition democracy. There are some benefits of democracy, and it also puts some limitations on what you can do and what you can't do. So especially in a coalition democracy where there isn't a clear majority, you have to take your partners along and get a consensus. And sometimes, you get pushed to a wall and there's a crisis, and it becomes very much easier to go ahead with the reforms. And I guess India's always done that very well. And you've seen that happen again. So, when there has been a lot of concern around slowing growth, the twin deficit, I think the government has gone ahead and done lots of things which are all in the positive direction. So they've announced some measures which will help towards fiscal consolidation by increasing fuel prices some more and reducing subsidies. They're looking actively at restructuring the subsidy program so that it gets more directed to means tested. So they're looking at cash transfers rather than generalized subsidies. I think that will have huge implications in the long term in terms of deficit. So it's an important thing to get done, and I think it will get done sooner rather than later. I think, we took some missteps in terms of GAR, for instance, which impacted the investment sentiment. I think we've realized that, rolled back. So we've shown a consciousness of listening to feedback and acting on it, which I think is positive as well. For India to get its growth story right, we need to get a couple of things done. We need to build out our infrastructure, which has been a relative weakness for the country. And we are trying to change the model about how the infrastructure will be built. So from being primarily a public developed infrastructure, we are experimenting with the PPP model. That has meant some things which have to be reconsidered and rolled back, and we've kind of gone through that process in the last 18 months, which has slowed down infrastructure development a little bit. But all the focus on it, all the noise around it is helping us, I think, to come across with policies which are going to be more sustainable for the future. So I think, this short-term pain that we are paying right now is actually going to be much better for the economy when you look at a 3 to 5 year view, because we will have a more sustainable, transparent PPP model.
Now, people who want to do business in India do often complain. First, there's the problem of, perhaps you can help explain to the audience, the different states and how the different states within India work and have their own rules. And secondly, there was an example quite recently of Vodafone, where there was a retrospective tax decision applied to Vodafone, right, which is the kind of thing which tends to alarm businesses if they're not sure the profits they make will ever end up with them. So perhaps you can comment on both those factors.
So I think, to be fair to India, India follows the rule of law and has always followed rule of law. And in this particular case, there was a profit that was made, and I think it would be legitimate for India to get the tax on that capital gains. However, we understand that the retrospective is probably not the best way to do it, because you create uncertainty in terms of the investment climate. And what I was referring to earlier is that the government has listened to the feedback and decided to take it on board and see how best to resolve the solution. So they're not being stubborn about it. They are looking at what's the best way to move forward. And I think they will find a solution.
And the individual states, I mean, is it possible to say that more of them are reforming now, or more of them are going in the opposite direction? How would you?
So I think, broadly, again, if we take a longer term view of how India might shape up, we have different states growing at different rates, depending upon the vision of the leaders of those states and what kind of reforms they're able to bring through. And I think going forwards, the states will end up having an even larger role to play in development. So the center is probably going to be more of an enabler, and the states will have more of a say on the precise development policies that they follow. And that will probably result in more efficient and faster growth. So I think actually that's a good trend that's happening. So Gujarat and Bihar, for instance, are growing at double-digit growth in an economy which is doing 5.5%, and they become an example, and then other states try and follow through, which is good.
And let's think about India as a consumer market as well. The sort of rough split between the Indian middle class and the poor. I'd like to hear your views on how that is at the moment and how that will develop, and also the role of women. It's good to have an Indian woman on stage. I was looking at the Indian literacy rate for women is still quite low, isn't it? It's 51%. Is there more chance that women will get to play a better role in the education system and in society?
So again, there is no, India is not one size fits all. So you'll see different things in different states. States like Kerala will have a very high literacy rate, including for women. And we are seeing increasingly a focus on educating women. Bihar, which I referred to a little while ago, has done specific programs to encourage women to go and complete education. So I think there's a realization that women have a role to play in economic development and development of the society. And there are lots of initiatives happening at the grassroots level and from the government level to allow more inclusion of women across social and economic activity. So I think that's pretty much on the right path, and a lot of people who come to India are surprised actually by how many women they find in the financial services sector and in the consumer sector in India, for example. So as I said, it's not one size fits all. Yeah. You may, at a national statistic level, feel that it's a problem, but there are just many more role models across different sectors of society which will help that to
And that
happen.
Indian middle class?
And as far as the middle class is concerned, again, that's the fastest growing segment of the population. And depending upon what cutoffs you want to take, the middle class could be defined as over 150 million households. And that's probably growing at a double-digit number again. So it is a large consuming class, and that's what gives the fillip in terms of consumption growth.
So within 10 years, it should be the size of an American market on that basis. 7 or 8 years, probably. 7 or 8 years to double at 10%, isn't it? Rule of 72, I should know that.
Yeah.
So there's potential for it. Well, let's turn to Brazil. And again, taking the numbers from the Economist. So looks like the annual growth rate this year is going to be 1.6%. Inflation is 5.3%. The current account deficit is 2.7% of GDP, and the budget deficit is 2.5% of GDP. Again, if we're looking at the BRICS as the sort of exemplar of the countries of the future, that doesn't sound too encouraging.
Yeah, I have to say the same thing Shikha just did. Is in our case, the trend rate of growth has been below India and China. It's probably somewhere between 3.5% and 4%, and we're having a slow year. I remember some years ago hearing from a former colleague at the Bank of Mexico. At one point he said, I have good news and bad news. The good news is we're having the first normal business cycle in Mexico. And he said that the bad news is we're in recession. So I think that very much applies to us. We're now seeing the overlap of a local recession driven by a very fast growth in 2010, perhaps a bit too much exuberance in the credit world, and now we're paying the price. And then on top of that, of course, we have the global anxiety, primarily driven right now by Europe, a little bit by China. So it's for us. The challenge is to actually grow a bit more. Consumption has been growing at an accelerated pace. Brazil has a strong, perhaps even extravagant social safety net. And people, when given a chance, consume. We're happy to report that the bottom half of our population is actually growing at a much faster rate than the top half. So we also see in Brazil the development of first of all, a fantastic decline in the poverty rate, and also the development of a lower middle class. That is not quite like the middle class here in the UK, let's be precise, but one that consumes, and also that plays a role in society's build-up of citizenship. So I think the news are good, or on the whole are good. What we need now is to invest more. We are a low investment country, and this main reason why we don't grow is that. We have major gaps in infrastructure and education, and it's really kind of mobilizing capital, getting the government to also be more effective in its role, so we can sustain a slightly higher rate of growth.
I mean, if India is a play on the burgeoning middle classes and the ability to outsource service industries to India, Brazil is seen as a play on commodities, the new oil field and out in the Atlantic. Is that a fair description, or is there a lot more to the Brazilian economy?
No, there is much more. Brazil is a very large, diversified economy. There's no question. In natural resources, we are a powerhouse, and we're probably the greatest available frontier in the world. But there's quite a bit more. We're a large service economy. Manufacturing is taking a bit of a beating now, but it's still very significant. So there's a bit of everything down there.
And is it more dependent now on China than on the US, would you say? Is it?
About the same. China has been a big consumer of commodities. That has given us some slack in the balance of payments, so it gives us a little more room to run. But we're not a very open economy, and I'm not bragging about that. It's not the best of things, but we're not that exposed. We're much less exposed than people think.
I suppose, you know, the great thing about Brazil's relative to the 1980s, you know, it looks fantastic. But, and that's, you know, true of some other Latin American economies as well. But do you, again, this question of whether the reform process is, you know, moving forward or whether it's halted, how do you sense the political situation?
It's moving forward, but slowly, sometimes grudgingly. The government doesn't have a natural reform bias. They are focusing on social policies, direct transfers, etc. And they have been less able to mobilize capital, and we need that. But you know, it is a government. You know, they have a government that was elected with that platform. That's pretty much what they're doing.
And I was at a table of guests last night, and the subject of Brazil came up, and they instantly said, law and order. There's a law and order problem in Brazil. I'm not sure I'd want to live there, move my business there. How do you sense the situation?
I don't agree. I think Brazil is one of the few countries, the emerging countries, where you can sue the government and you can win and life goes on. And you know, there are other large countries, not India, but certainly some others where that couldn't happen. We're now seeing a big Supreme Court case that is primarily dealing with members of the government's party, and they're all being convicted by a court that was appointed by the same party.
I think they were thinking of crime on the streets.
On the streets,
rather
yeah.
than
Well, there's that. It's still an equal and middle income country. But take the case of Rio, where I'm from. Rio is those of you who've been there know it's a really lovely place. But it's sprinkled with slums, and for years those slums were out of the reach of the state, the formal state. So they were like mini states controlled by local, let's call them local leaders, drug leaders or whatnot. And as of 3 years ago, the local government started to take over in an operation that most people thought was not doable, and they're succeeding. People in the slums are very happy. Real estate prices are going up a lot. And we're basically having a boost in how happy people are, you know, folks who live in these slums. So I think the news is pretty good. Crime rates are generally going down. No, not that we don't have a lot of work to do, but it's not unlike, say, here, New York City. If you don't know where you're going at night, you can end up in some pretty terrible neighborhoods. So, you know, same thing there.
Absolutely. Let's move on. Unfortunately, you two are representing the whole of the emerging markets here as well as your countries, though we've had quite a bit of in China today, so let's, if we can steer clear of China, talk about the rest of Latin America and how you see the situation. Argentina, obviously seen as the other great economic power of Latin America. We in Economist don't believe their inflation rate and have ceased to publish it. Rather suspicious of the government there. How do you see the picture?
I see the region really split at this point. It's very hard to talk of Latin America, because you have, on the one hand, you have Chile, you have Mexico, Brazil, Peru, Colombia, well-run, very well-run economy. And then on the other hand, you have Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia for sure, although they just issued a bond. Interesting how things happen under the same leadership. This tells you a little bit about the world with zero interest rates.
Yeah.
And then Argentina. Of course, Argentina has been the puzzle for a long time, and it remains a frustrating case, you know, with all the ingredients seemingly there, but they seem unable to put it all together to work.
It was one of the world's richest countries in 1890, wasn't it?
It was sort of like Canada in 1900. I think our income per capita was 10% of Argentina's, and we're getting close to them right now as we speak. So that's a split region. I suspect over time this more chaotic model is not going to work, and our side will win the day, but it might take a while.
So, I mean, you could make analogies to Asia as it was, so that there's the Korean example or the Taiwanese example, and there was the old Chinese example, and that and Singapore in the good camp again.
Yeah.
Do you think that those economies will be successful, the reform economies as it were, and then the others will eventually?
That's happening,
Yeah.
and it's also happening inside Brazil. We also have, you know, a number of states, and you see the difference, and you see also the voters rewarding better behavior at the local level. There are some underlying trends that I believe in the end will work. I generally think things tend to work if you have a role model, if you see something not far from you that works. And I think we have enough of that in the region that it will move things in this direction.
Let's talk about South Asia then, and obviously India, because it's had this long history with Pakistan and also the relationship with Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, it's sort of, there are big geopolitical issues, as well as the question of how the South Asian economies are reforming. How do you see the picture?
So first of all, in the South Asian economies, yes, I think there are quite a few which are going down the path of high growth: Indonesia, Vietnam, Sri Lanka. And I think they will all catch up in terms of reform and growth as well. And I think that is what will finally bring peace as well. So yes, India and Pakistan have had a history of conflict at different points of time. But there's a clear understanding, you know, even in Kashmir, which has been a slightly difficult situation for India sometimes, or Punjab before that, that ultimately when you get law and order and peace and economic prosperity, that is the only thing that creates sustainable results. And I think that understanding is coming very much there. So while politicians may think that something's going to make them win elections, on a sustainable basis, you're not going to stay there until you have economic prosperity and peace. And you know, while it sounds difficult because you always have a couple of these incidents, I think we can see a clear direction that it's going in that direction. You know, whether it's Sri Lanka, you're seeing peace come back and prosperity come back. We're seeing that in Kashmir, Bangladesh, and I'm sure in Pakistan as well.
I should explain to the audience that 30,000 copies of The Economist were impounded in Mumbai this week because we
got the maps.
published a map which put all the nations, all the continents of the world inside Africa to show how big Africa was. And India censors any map that doesn't show it controlling all of Kashmir, so they just impounded it, which is quite extraordinary in the world's largest democracy, but it rather caught us by surprise. So it's sort of occupational hazard.
But I believe you did it the second time, so.
Oh, well, we published the internationally recognized map, but it just happened to be a law in India you can't do that. So it's a strange business. But anyway, I wanted to throw it open to the floor for questions. Obviously, India and Brazil. There's someone right at the back there, lady right at the back.
Hi, my name is Sonakshi and I'm a lawyer from India. My question is for Shikha. This is regarding the Vodafone issue that we talked about, and you said in India we follow the rule of law. I mean, my question is then why, when the Supreme Court passed a judgment in favor of Vodafone, our government went and enacted a legislation, not to mention it was retrospective, which was against such investments. And the thing is, like, if in India we are bringing in reforms today to attract foreign investors, how can we actually gain that confidence when we cannot show to the outside investor that there is a harmony between our legislation and judiciary, which I believe are the two significant pillars of our democracy?
Thank you.
Yeah, so first of all, I think the Indian government has clarified that this is not the only situation where retrospective legislation has happened. It's happened in other developed countries as well. And from India's point of view, when you have a large transaction like that, and it's clearly a transaction of an Indian company, and no tax is paid into India, I think that's something for us to think about. And I think there was a very strong case for doing legislative change prospectively. The retrospective is, I agree with you, is something that was probably not best done. And I think the good news is that we are in conversation and looking at what's the best thing to move forward. But by and large, you would agree, if you're a lawyer from India, that India does follow rule of law much more than you might find in many other places.
There was a gentleman in the front here.
Thank you, Baldas. This is a question for you, Ms. Sharma. India has a very large young population, roughly around 600 million or so, under the age of 25. My view is that it is a tremendous demographic dividend. I would be interested in your views on, in this young population, aspirationally, do you see an entrepreneurial, energetic vibe to overcome? Or, well, I would like your views on this. Thank you.
I actually think that is one of the big advantages of India. So first of all, just to your question, Philip, on the middle income groups, I would like to say exactly what Min said, that the definition of middle income in India could be very different from the definition of middle income in the US. So that's probably not directly comparable, but just in terms of a consumption class, it's a large class. The one interesting thing for me, I've been working in India for 30 years, is that what drives India and lets India grow despite some of the limitations of a coalition democracy is exactly this issue of an aspirational population where everybody wants to strive hard to better the lot for their family. And as women come in more into economics, I think that's going to become even stronger because there's a very strong desire to do better so that your children can lead a better life. And that can be a big, big motivator at the really low income category of population. But one interesting trend that I'm seeing, and it's really accelerated over this last couple of years, is many more people willing to go out there and do entrepreneurial things rather than looking for a salaried job. So I passed out from IIM Ahmedabad, which was one of India's leading management institutes, and from our batch, I think there were less than 3% of the people who are willing to do something on their own. If you go to the same institute today after 30 years, there's about 25 to 30% of the people who pass out from school who want to try and do something on their own. So that's clearly taking root. And so we are seeing this aspirational drive through different economic strata in many different ways. And I think clearly it's one of the advantages of India. And some of the stuff around fiscal deficit where we are doing money transfers to the rural poor will all actually benefit that, because once you get past that difficulty of striving to live, that's when the aspiration can be made to be effective in terms of economic growth.
I just want to finish with a very quick question to you, Arminio, because not to mention the fact that the UK's third quarter GDP 1%, over 4% annualized, thanks in part to the Olympics. Brazil has the World Cup in 2014, the Olympics in 2016. Do you think those are extremely positive things for the Brazilian economy that will help drive growth forward in those years?
I think they're certainly very good for our mindset. The Olympics will certainly drive some growth in Rio, and I think the World Cup a little bit, but
you've got the stadium already, yeah.
Yeah, they're being fixed up. It's more for us, in a way, a signal, and more to ourselves than to the world, that this is happening, that we can do it, and as our self-esteem, it's a bit higher than it was, say, 10, 15, 20 years ago when we were, going through those tough times. So it's a sign of the times.
Yeah. Well, the red light's flashing on me, and my boss is due on next, so I better get off the stage. But I'd like you to thank our participants very much indeed. Thank you.